So it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Louise Dye. She is a professor of nutrition and behavior at the University of Leeds. She is the president of ILSI Europe and has served on their expert groups, including one on natural plant-based ingredients and another on cognitive function. She is a chartered health psychologist and is the associate editor of Nutritional Neuroscience and the European Journal of Nutrition. Her research interests include functional foods for well-being, stress management, mental health, and cognitive performance decline.
And thank you for the great introduction, Jeff. He's right. I'm a psychologist who's really interested in the effects of food on behavior. So what I wanted to do today, before we talk about the impact of tea on cognition, it makes sense to talk about what is cognition. And we can think about that as something that varies across the lifespan. So with children, we're looking at trying to enhance their cognitive development so they reach high levels of ability, so that when we go into older age, we prevent cognitive aging, and that decline, if you like, goes much more slowly or as slow as possible. However, measuring cognitive performance over the course of the lifespan and even on a day-to-day variation is actually quite difficult. So we need to have appropriate measures of cognitive function, and we need to have those in order to be able to say something about the effects of the foods that we ingest or the tea that we drink in this case. So we're looking with, or certainly my research is very much looking at how we optimize cognitive performance through diet, nutrition, etc. So in terms of cognitive domains then and how we might measure them, we very often split cognition up into memory, which could be short or long term, reaction time, so how quickly you can do something, and attention, which might be selective attention or a sustained attention. And I'm going to draw your attention to the different types of attention today, because those are really important when we look at the effects of tea. So sustained attention is the ability to attend to a stimulus or maintain an activity over a long period of time. If you think about someone working in a nuclear power plant, you want them to be able to attend to all the buttons and dials and displays, but to notice when something changes. Selective attention, though, is about the ability to attend to a specific stimulus or an activity in the presence of other distracting stimuli. So trying to spot something that's the wrong shape on a conveyor belt, maintaining that attention and selecting out those important bits of information. Attention switching is the ability to change the focus of attention between two or more stimuli. And tea might be quite an important nutrient or intervention to help us with attention. So what we did as part of an ILSI expert group a few years ago was look at how we might select cognitive tests in order to be sensitive to the effects of foods and nutrients. And so it's really important that if we want to make a claim on a food or a beverage, we use tests that can pick up changes over time or after ingestion. We can move now then to look at the effects of tea on cognitive function, looking at those selected cognitive tests. Here's an example of an attention switching test. So the person sees a letter and a number on the screen in rapid succession. They're either asked to press the button if the letter is a vowel or a consonant, or if it's in a particular colour, and that rule will be applied for 3 trials, and then the rule switches. So you press the button if the red number is even or odd, for example, and that rule switches all the time. What goes on in the brain as you process that information, though, we can pick up with event-related potentials. And this is just showing you that when you switch, you have this kind of anticipated change, deciding, do I go or don't I go? On the first one, that's really a difficult task. The second repeat is much easier, and that decision to go starts to separate from the decision not to go. And then it's easier again on the third repeat. So we can look at then the difference or the switch cost between that activation in the brain as you do that task. What we see when people have drunk tea versus placebo and then are asked to perform that task is that on that task, their correct responses are greater, so they get a greater percentage of correct response having drunk tea compared with placebo. And the time since they first drank it makes a difference too. So you see this improvement over time. But also subjectively, participants felt much more alert when doing that task. So it's not just an objective measure, it's also how those individuals feel. So in order to prepare for this talk, I did a little bit of a systematic review, looking at the effects of tea constituents to see what evidence do we have. Green tea contains epigallocatechin gallate, so EGCG, and that's about 65% of catechins. It also contains theanine and caffeine. So when we search for green tea, epigallocatechin, ECGC, L-theanine, and we combined those terms with things like memory, attention, reaction time, those cognitive function terms. Doing that, screening quite a lot of literature from a number of different databases, we actually end up with 7 studies. Finally, we excluded 2 where there was a measure of mini-mental state. That's a measure of dementia. And I'm staying away from dementia here. I'm looking at healthy adults aged 18 plus who've been participated in randomized controlled trials. So we end up with 7 studies that we can look at in detail. So there's a lot of information on this table. But I think what I want to draw your attention to is that most of these have given theanine or catechins. They've mostly given them as supplements. So half the studies actually gave capsules rather than a tea drink. They all gave varying doses and they used different measures of cognitive function. But I've tried to pick out the cognitive domain that was most affected and then said whether this was improved or impaired. And I think when you scan down this column, you see that most of the attention measures were improved by the ingestion of either green tea or its constituents. There are some couple of studies that show an improvement in working memory, which is also a kind of attention. It's holding information in your head for a short period of time and working with that information. So we see overall across those 7 studies an improvement in cognition, particularly attention. So although there's only a small number of well-conducted, blinded, randomized controlled trials that either had a positive control or a placebo control in non-impaired healthy samples, most of them use capsules rather than tea, and most of those positive effects could be attributed to either the L-theanine in the tea or the L-theanine and the caffeine. Although those studies used a large range of cognitive tests, the most consistent effects were seen on tests of attention. What that suggests is that maybe some of those other tests were less sensitive. So I want to take you on a little bit now and say, well, we're looking at healthy individuals. Healthy individuals experience stress and tea might be beneficial. So we're always going to be exposed to stressors. So here you see the zebras, they're happily grazing in the field. Along comes a lion. What they got to do? They've got to run away from that lion. So they need to have a physiological flight response. And then they go back to grazing. And the important thing about stress in everyday life is our ability to return to that low stress state. How good are we doing that? The zebra's doing it quite well there. In our lives, stress, though, doesn't necessarily go away. You remember this from the film Airplane? So stress occurs to most adult humans as a response to an imbalance between what the situation is demanding of us and the responses that we have to cope with that situation. So stress then is a pattern of cognitive appraisals, physiological responses, and behavioral tendencies. We learn how to react because it's what we've experienced last. We can measure stress in lots of ways. If we want to look at how chronically stressed someone is, we can take hair samples. So hair samples close to the scalp will tell you something about stress that someone's experienced over the last 6 months. Or we can ask people to measure their cortisol, which we can detect in saliva or in blood samples in a very acute way. And both of those kinds of measures have been used in studies of nutrition. Important, though, also is to find out how someone subjectively experiences stress. So we might ask someone to rate how stressed they feel at this moment, from not at all to extremely. Because, as I said before, stress is also in the eye of the perceiver. When we look at green tea, stress activates the adrenal cortex. We perceive it in the brain, it activates the hypothalamus, that activates the adrenal cortex, and we get that cortisol response that would normally, if we were a zebra or to run away, to fight or flight from the thing that is causing us stress. In most of our everyday situations, we can't run away from an angry boss. We certainly shouldn't fight the angry boss, but having a cup of tea might actually be beneficial because L-theanine in that tea reduces the cortisol response to acute stress. So there's something about, someone being distressed and that everyday response of I'll put the kettle on, I'll make a cup of tea, that might actually be very beneficial to reducing our cortisol response. We also know that, and you're going to hear a lot more about this in this symposium today, that L-theanine also attenuates cardiovascular responses. So in an acute stressful situation, you have a cardiovascular response, which is your preparation to fight or flight, and the constituents in tea can actually lower that cardiovascular response. I said that what's going on in the brain is quite important, and there's growing interest in the potential for tea and its constituents to modulate brain activity. And here you can see alpha waves that are associated with an alert but relaxed state, and theta waves that are associated with, falling asleep, becoming much more relaxed. So if we measure EEG, electroencephalogram, brain waves in a relaxed state, in a rested state, that tells us about the relative level of consciousness of the individual. And what we can see from studies of tea, green tea in particular, is that measuring EEG shows us that green tea has a capacity to moderate that resting state alpha activity. So you see, compared with control, over a period of 105 minutes, you get an increased alpha rate, so an increased relaxed state. And that stress matters for our cognitive function because when we're under conditions of stress, that affects our ability to maintain attention, to remember things, to coordinate our motor skills, and to exercise executive function, to make judgments and distinct decision making. So stress shapes our cognitive function. It shapes how we comprehend, store, and use information. So if we look at some recent studies of stress and its constituents on how we actually perform cognitively when we've been exposed to stress, one of the most stressful things you can do is public speaking. Another thing that you can do to stress people out is actually make them do mental arithmetic. Most adults find on the spot mental arithmetic very, very stressful. It increases their blood pressure, it increases their cortisol output. And the Uchida-Kraepelin test is a mental arithmetic task that was used in these Japanese studies. What they did was they looked at young adults and they gave them 2 grams of matcha or green tea for 2 weeks in one study and showed that the young adults were able to maintain their attention. They repeated the study in older adults and found that just a single dose of matcha improved attention. And then when they repeated that dosing into a chronic study that went on for 12 weeks, the work capacity of those adults was also increased. So matcha combined with caffeine improved both attention and work performance under stress, but it was better than caffeine alone. So the effect there wasn't just due to the caffeine, which can be alerting, it was due to the green tea constituents as well. And I thought it might be interesting to look at some of the health claims on tea and its constituents. So in Europe, there has been a claim for beneficial effects of tea and its constituents. Searching the EFSA register gave us 7 dossiers and they were all rejected, but they covered things ranging from improvement of cognitive function, alleviation of psychological stress, sleep and menstrual discomfort, and focus and improvement of attention. As I said, those were all rejected. There has been one claim on black tea and attention, which was a proprietary claim made by Unilever in 2018. But this was The effects on attention were very much ascribed to the caffeine content of the tea. So owing to its caffeine content, the claim that black tea improves attention was substantiated. And they showed that 2 to 3 servings of black tea providing at least 75 milligrams of caffeine in total should be consumed within 90 minutes, and the target population was adults in general. That claim was not passed by the European Parliament, and that was because of the caffeine content and anxieties around caffeine. So where we go next, I think, is to look at cause and effect mechanisms. We need clinical trials. We need to be able to have enough information to be able to have meta-analyses. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.